On the 6th of April 1990, people boarded the ferry Scandinavian Star, being super excited to go on a vacation. The trip was supposed to be a regular cruise from Norway to Denmark, and everything went just fine at first. But when people went to sleep that night, no one was expecting to wake up from thick black smoke. The Scandinavian Star had mysteriously caught on fire, leaving many people stuck in their cabins, passed out from the smoke, or desperately trying to find their way through the smoke-filled hallways. But what truly happened to the passenger ferry that night? This is the case of the Scandinavian Star fire. So hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Elin, and on this channel I cover true crime cases that have occurred in the Nordic countries. Some content warnings before we start this video. This video will include talks about arson, and I will also briefly discuss the death of kids and a pregnant woman. So if that's something that you don't want to watch, then I suggest you click out of this video right now. If you like my channel, please subscribe, and now let's get into the case that happened on the sea between Denmark and Norway. So MS Scandinavian Star, originally named MS Massalia, was a car and passenger ferry built in France in 1971. MS Massalia was built by a company and was then mostly cruising in the Mediterranean Sea. By 1984, the ship had been owned by a number of companies and had various different names, before finally being named Scandinavian Star, a name given to the ship by Scandinavian World Cruises. Scandinavian Star was at this point mostly doing cruises from Florida. In 1990, Scandinavian Star was put into service on a route from Norway to Denmark for the Norwegian shipping line DANO-linjen after a Danish businessman bought it and converted the ship from a casino to a passenger ferry. This man had previously been sentenced to 40 days suspended sentence after having too many passengers on the ferry, as well as too little life vests on the boats. So Scandinavian Star's new crew had to be trained in just 10 days to learn their new responsibilities, and for a ship of this size, the training should have been way longer than this. Many of the crew could not speak English, Norwegian, or Danish, which would obviously not be effective in an emergency situation. The crew consisted of 62 Portuguese, 2 Spanish people, 1 Brazilian, 7 Americans, and 15 Scandinavians, so most people did not speak any Nordic language on the ferry. A technical leader for the Norwegian Marine Insurance Company had inspected the ship and had declared that the ferry was not ready for departure, as some of the fire doors did not work and the lifeboats were not in good condition. Basically, any type of disaster could be very deadly, as there was also not enough sprinklers on the ship and the emergency signs were only in the roof, which is obviously not good in case of a fire. But everything moved quickly to get the ship out cruising, and the crew was told that there was no time for fire practices or even taking the passengers' names. The first trip with passengers from Oslo in Norway happened only 6 days before the night of the events. People on board noted that the ship was in very bad condition and there was even rats running around on the ship. So on the 6th of April 1990, people boarded the Scandinavian Star, and as I said, people were super excited to go on a vacation. At night, people went to sleep, especially families with kids, and others went to the restaurant to eat or to the bar watching the singers perform. During the night of 7th of April 1990, at about 2 a.m. local time, a fire broke out at the ferry. This was discovered by 2 passengers who first tried to put out the fire, but for some reason it was very hard. This was also told to the receptionist, but when the fire was put out, everyone just went back into their cabins. But the boys who found the fire had a very bad feeling about it, and they basically did not want to go to sleep, so they just stayed awake since they had a gut feeling that someone had set the fire. They actually told the other people in their cabin to sleep with their clothes on, and after not getting sleep, they went out on deck to get some fresh air. As they were standing in the stairs between decks talking to others, they suddenly saw smoke coming from the deck under them. So they ran to the receptionist and told her that there was another fire, but at first she did not believe them. But when the smoke started coming into the receptionist understood that the situation was actually serious. The stairwell and ceilings acted as chimneys for the fire to spread, as the decorative covering on the walls was extremely flammable, and because of this the fire spread easily. They also produced toxic fumes when being burned. So when the captain learned about the fire, he attempted to close the fire doors on deck 3. The fire alarm was made in a way that someone actually had to push a button when there was a fire to start the alarm, so it was not an automatic alarm. This is why the fire alarm did not even start during the first fire. The fire doors were not designed for automatic closing and did not respond since emergency alarms near the doors had not been put on by passengers or crew. The receptionist tried to push the fire alarm button after the second fire, but it did not work. In the vehicle storage area, there was large fans ventilating to remove exhaust fumes, and the fans pulled air through and caused the fire to spread even more, especially through the stairways located on either end. The captain later ordered his crew to turn off the ventilation system as he realized that it was feeding the fire, and an unintended result was that smoke was able to enter passenger cabins through the door vents. The fire had at this point already spread from deck 3 to 4 and stopped at deck 5. Some tried to hide from the smoke in areas such as closets and bathrooms or remain asleep in bed, but were eventually overcome by the smoke. Those who tried to escape may have encountered thick smoke, confusing corridor layouts, and poorly trained crew members. It was also completely dark from the smoke, and passengers struggled to find their way through the smoke-filled corridors. So the captain now ordered the general alarms to be activated, told everyone to abandon the ship, and sent out a mayday request. Chaos broke out at the ship, and people were desperately trying to find their way out on deck and into lifeboats. Grown-up men literally pushed aside kids to get before them into the lifeboats. Some of the lifeboats were rusty and almost broke when they were lowered into the water, and some even started taking in water or the oars broke off when they started rowing. The passengers who were rescued from the ship just prayed that their loved ones would be okay. The captain and the crew actually abandoned the ship before all passengers were evacuated, leaving many still on board the burning ship. The captain also lied to the rescue services, saying that there was no people left on board the ship, even if there was many people and even children still on board. When he was later asked why he left the ship before all the passengers, he said, "Do you think I should have burned up too?" So the ship was towed to Lysekil in Sweden, and now the fire was almost burned out already. Eyewitnesses here saw 3 people jump off from the boat as it came to the harbor, and these people were never found afterwards. Suddenly the ship started burning again, and this time it came from the ship's restaurant, so it was in a completely different location from before. They had a hard time stopping this fire, and basically everything was destroyed. When the rescue team finally started going through the ship, there were dead people in almost every cabin. The rescue team described these scenes as horrible, and one of them said, "If there is a hell on earth, it is here." One man was found in his cabin behind the shower curtain, holding both of his kids in his arms. They all had towels around their faces, but they had unfortunately lost their lives. One man lost his pregnant wife after she tried to find her way through the smoke-filled hallway. A brother who lost his sister in the fire stated that day he saw the light in his father's eyes go out. The captain said that Scandinavian Star was carrying 395 passengers and 97 crew members the day of the fire. It was later determined that 158 people, or approximately 1/3 of all passengers on board, died on the ship. Another victim died 2 weeks later from his injuries, and 136 of those killed were Norwegian. As many of the victims' remains were damaged by the fire, more than 100 specialists worked to identify all the recovered remains. The victims were someone's children, someone's pregnant wife, someone's mother, and someone's whole family. Some people probably could not find their way out because of the thick smoke that covered the exit route signs. On deck 5, where most of passenger deaths occurred, the hallways were arranged in a layout that contained dead ends and did not otherwise logically lead to emergency exits. From the start, it was clear that the ship was set on fire and that it was not an accident. There was not only one fire on the ship, as one fire had started on the car deck in the stairway. This was the biggest fire that caused most damage, and there were actually two mattresses between the fire doors so that it could not be closed. So there are two big theories or suspects in this case. An Oslo police investigation initially put suspicion on a man called Erik Andersen. He was a Danish truck driver who had 3 previous convictions for arson and was therefore said to be a pyromaniac. In the 70s and 80s, he had been sentenced for 4 arsons, and he always set the fire when he was upset and then went to sleep after. 3 of the times he went to sleep in the same house that he set on fire. In one case, he had been out drinking and he had been trying on girls, but nobody wanted to talk to him, so he went back to his hotel room and he set it on fire and then went to sleep. Erik had taken this route many times, and the crew described him as always flirting with the young girls. In his cabin on the boat, they found a map of the emergency exits that he had taken from somewhere else on the boat. One of the crew members said that he had asked her to come to his cabin, which tells that he had been trying on girls that night and also been rejected. He was actually married, and his wife describes him as a loving husband and doubts that he did it, but she's not completely sure. The only problem with this theory is that there were multiple fires on the boat that night, and Erik was actually killed in one of the first 2 fires. So basically it could not have been him setting the last fires, but it is however possible that it was so hot on the boat that after the first fires, the others somehow started. There is also no evidence to suggest that Erik Andersen actually started these fires. So the second theory is that this was actually done by a group of people. Several fire experts believe that there were at least 4 fires that night, and they were not just one fire that escalated, but rather individual fires started at different times. A later investigation determined that there were several separate fires and that multiple people would have been needed to start them, especially if they were not familiar with the layout of the ship. The same report also claimed that 9 members of the crew were likely to be responsible for 6 separate fires on the Scandinavian Star, as well as multiple acts of sabotage. The report proposed that the motive for the crime was insurance fraud, as the ship was insured for twice its value shortly before the fire broke out. The report claims that multiple people with insider knowledge of the ship were required for the events to unfold as they did. So this report was controversial and also unproven, but it did lead to police interest, and in 2014 the investigation was officially reopened and charges dropped against the deceased suspect Erik Andersen. The theory was basically that the fire was a sabotage and was set by members of the ship's crew. So one thing that I thought was interesting to add was that the Scandinavian Star had been stricken by other fires throughout its history and had a very bad safety record. During the investigation of the 1990 fire, investigators learned that unreported fires had also occurred in 1985, caused by a deep fryer, and twice more in 1988. On the 15th of March 1988, just a few days after the first fire, a second fire started in the engine room. And it's just interesting to think about if there was possibly some kind of connection between these fires. So to this day, it's still unclear exactly what happened to the Scandinavian Star that night and who possibly killed 158 people. Some people believe that the fires were not set and that the whole thing was some kind of accident, but most people believe that the fires were set by someone or possibly a group of people. I personally believe that the ship was set on fire, but the motive for me is very unclear. I mean, why kill all of these innocent people? The ship was eventually repaired and put back into ferry service as the Regal Voyager, initially in the Mediterranean and later in the Caribbean. In 2004, the ship was scrapped and is no longer cruising the seas. But that's all that I have for this case today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that I will see you in my next case. Goodbye, everyone.